Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm managing editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Hello, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation for as little as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcast, our complete newsletter, and all of our exclusive religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/MormonLand. Now for today's show. In 1998, a Utah publisher released A World of Faith, a children's book by our very own Peggy Fletcher Stack with illustrations by celebrated Latter-day Saint artist Kathleen Peterson. Praise for the volume was wide and deep, including from former President Jimmy Carter. A commemorative version followed in 2001 to celebrate Salt Lake City's hosting of the 2002 Winter Olympics. The book's approach is simple. Take many of the world's major faith traditions, write a one-page explanation of their history and beliefs, make the text easy enough for youngsters but interesting enough for seasoned readers, and pair each entry with a gorgeous illustration depicting aspects of that religion. Yes, it's a modest model, but behind it rests a profound pursuit. Eliminate religious bigotry through increased understanding and turn today's readers into tomorrow's peacemakers. Now, 25 years later, BCC Press has issued a revised second edition of A World of Faith, with an additional 6 non-Western religions added into the mix. With this release, we're making this special offer. Join Mormon Land on Patreon by Monday, May 15th, and you'll be entered to win one of 5 signed copies of the book. Current patrons will also be entered. Now for the show, authors to join us today to discuss the revised and expanded book. Welcome to Peggy in studio and Kathleen via Zoom in Spring City. Glad to have you both with us.
Happy to be here once again.
So Kathleen, let me start with you. How did you get together with Peggy?
Well, that's a good question. I did an illustration, or I illustrated a book with Pat Bagley, who had a children's book publishing company at that time. And after we published that book, we came up with the idea of doing a book on world religions. And Pat said, I know just the person to pair you with. So that's how I met Peggy. That's the way I remember it. Do you remember it that same way, Peggy?
Similar. Pat did talk to me. Pat, who, by the way, is our cartoonist for the Tribune, long time. Pat did approach me and asked me if I was interested in writing this book with Kathleen. And I said, no, I'm not an expert in world religions. I have a full-time job and little kids. I'm not interested in this. I don't feel qualified. I don't want to do it. But then one day I took one of my children to a Presbyterian service at the First Presbyterian Church. There was the Kirkin of the Tartans, the Blessing of the Tartans. We listened to the service and then we went outside, and my son wanted to know exactly what did Presbyterians believe and how was that different from what we believe. And I thought, oh, I'll just go get a book. But there wasn't any such book for children. There's lots of big books for adults. If you want to know everything about Christianity or world religions, get a big book. But if you want to explain simply to children, there wasn't any book. So then I thought, okay, maybe I could do this with Kathleen's help. And then we just began researching like crazy.
And that Tartan connection is in that section on Presbyterians in the book.
It is. Yeah. Because who knew? I mean, lots of people don't really realize that Presbyterianism is really the Church of Scotland.
Yes. Mary Queen of Scots, right?
Right.
Which I learned from the book. So Peggy and Kathleen, how did you decide on the format?
Well, I'll tell you about the text, and Kathleen can tell you about how she came up with the format or rubric for the illustrations. Early on, I decided that each page would be 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph would talk about the origins of the faith group, and the second paragraph would be about contemporary or practices within those, and that I would emphasize ones that they have in common. Lots of faiths have baby rituals and coming of age rituals and baptism and marriage, even funeral rituals, although we didn't talk a lot about funeral rituals. So it would be like origin and then practices, which works pretty well with all these Christian denominations because most of those have founders, organizers or founders, prophets, priests, whatever. And some of the world religions have that too. But then some world religions, and especially Native American or African religions, they don't really have founders. And so in those cases, I chose to do creation stories or origin stories about the group. So it's kind of a mix in that way, but that format seemed to work. What about you, Kathleen?
Well, I had Peggy did all the planning of which religions, and it was my idea or my feeling that I wanted it to be a picture book, so that you could look at the pictures and get the whole story. So I used a border around the outside that had symbols or things that were peculiar or particular to that faith. And then the inside of the border, I tried to get a male and female, adults, children, and a particular building that might relate to that religion. So it didn't work for all of them, but it was a good way to start.
Like a big mosque in one place or something like that. Sometimes you see, yes. And it seems like as you're looking at it, it seems like the ideal experience for a child would be have an adult or parent reading the book to the child, right? And the child being engrossed in the pictures and asking questions as they come. And the artwork it's explained what's in the artwork. You know what I mean? What this is showing and what it's representing. So let me ask you, Kathy, I'm going to start with you first as the artist. What were some of the challenges you faced?
Well, the first one was we had to make a decision about when in history to do the illustrations from, because really nowadays everybody is Western and we all look the same. So we talked about that and chose to do kind of a historic look, because that would be far more fun, far more colorful to do kind of historic looking clothing. And it's not exactly parallel with all of them, but it does make them more unique, more colorful, more fun, and more distinct from each other.
Peggy, what about you as the writer? What were their challenges?
Well, there's so many challenges, and Kathleen is modest, but honestly, the challenges were all over the place, even for her. First of all, let's just remind our listeners, this was 1997 when we were putting this together. No internet. We were like living at the libraries. And
you couldn't just Google and say, yes.
Google. Nope. We had to go to the library, check out books or buy books.
Those big books you were talking about.
Exactly. And we don't live in the same city. So Kathleen had to do a lot of her own research and I did mine. And then sometimes we would talk on the phone. Do you remember this, Kathleen? I went to Reformation Sunday at the Lutheran Church. And because Kathleen was always asking me, well, what color would be good for this faith group or that faith group? And I, of course, have no idea. She's our visual person. And I went to Reformation Sunday and everyone was wearing red. And so I said to the minister, why is everyone wearing red? And he said, oh, red is the color of the Holy Spirit. So I called Kathy and I said, red for the Lutherans. And anyway, so we had a lot of challenges with that, even after we had decided what faith groups to choose. And then so of course you're taking these centuries old faiths and turning them into 2 paragraphs. So for me as a writer, the big challenge was what to include and what to not include, what's important and what's not important. So very early on, I knew that after we had my first draft of the text, I would have to get every single page approved by either someone in that faith group or an expert on religion who could help with that, a scholar or something. And miraculously, of the 28 first edition faiths, 26 are in Utah. And I should mention it's in alphabetical order. Mm-hmm. So the two, ironically, that are not in Utah, Amish and Zoroastrian.
Wow.
So the A and the Z are not here. So I did get experts. But the challenge of reducing these things, the danger, as our listeners who are Latter-day Saints would know, is that you pick, as a reader, a writer, you pick something that sounds really interesting and unique to highlight, but people in that faith say, well, yeah, technically we believe in that, but it's not really important. And for example, I'll use a Mormon example. Am I going to put Kolob in my one paragraph about Latter-day Saints? Well, no. I mean, most members would say, well, technically we believe in that, or the 3 degrees of glory, we believe in that. But are those ideas worthy of the first or second paragraph? So that's, and so many writers get those things wrong about Mormonism that drives members crazy. So I knew that I couldn't do that to all these other faiths. Mm-hmm. And that was a huge challenge. And Kathleen had her own challenges also.
What about you, Kathy, on those? What to put in, what to leave out, and how to depict things?
Maybe I can answer that this way. One, after I did the paintings, I showed them to, well, Peggy had some, but I showed some to my friends too. And I have a friend who is a member of the Catholic Church. And when I showed her my depiction, which I thought was beautiful, she said, well, I guess technically that's right, just like Peggy said. But she said, you make it look like it's all cathedral and nuns and priests. And she said, you haven't got the lay people represented. Mm. So I said, well, what do you think of? What do you think is important about the Catholic Church? And she said, well, for me, communion was the most important thing. And that's really significant in her life. So I redid the whole painting with that theme and with appreciation. And there were a couple more, but that was maybe one good example.
And it seems like language would be a big deal. In other words, you'd want to use language that the members of that faith would recognize. That's the language that they would use, even though it may not be universal language for everyone, right? I mean, like a Latter-day Saint, where this is Mormon land, would call communion sacrament. So you want to say sacrament, you know what I mean? So did you find that, Peggy?
Oh, all the time. I mean, Kathy's talking about Catholics. I also ran my Catholic page by Monsignor Mannion, who was at the cathedral at the time. And I had written about the Mass and communion. And he tried really hard. I didn't get it right the first time, because Catholics really believe that the bread and wine are the real blood and body of Christ. And I kept saying, but kids won't understand that. What is this? Cannibalism? This is not going to go over well. And ultimately, I simply let the language be the language that he used, even though personally I thought it might be confusing for kids. But it's their language. Who am I to say otherwise?
And you learn from the book, Catholics aren't alone in that belief.
Yeah, they are not alone in that belief. And anyway, there are many times like that where language just makes so much difference. I'll give you another example. This religion actually is not in the second edition, but Christian Sciences. So I write about Mary Baker Eddy, the founder, falling on the ice, breaking her leg and praying. And then I had said she was miraculously healed. And then I showed it to the head of the Christian Scientist in Utah. And she said, oh, no, we never use the word miracle. It was the science of healing. And so I said, okay, we'll take that out. And she was so grateful. She said, that word miracle is in encyclopedias. It's in although no one ever asks us that, but we do not use that word.
Interesting. And I wouldn't even have thought of that, of course. And you didn't either.
Me either.
Right?
I just thought, oh, this is a positive thing. And speaking of language like that, I always, I'm in the book, each religion is depicted ideally. There's no dark side of any of these faith groups. And the language is completely at home with angels and miracles and blessings and divine intervention and all of those things that believers talk about. And I don't make a distinction. I don't try to write like some dispassionate observer, distant. I wanted it to be in language that kids and their parents would read and feel not mocked, but valued for their attachment to divinity. So anyway, there's fully at home with that kind of language. Yeah. So miracle seemed like a positive word to me.
Absolutely.
But
it's just not the word they would use.
It's not their word.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you now, just what prompted the Olympic edition? Because not that much time had passed since the edition came out. Why the Olympic edition?
Well, the Interfaith Roundtable, Salt Lake's Interfaith Roundtable was getting ready for the Olympics. And they wanted to make it clear to visitors that Utah is not only Mormon land, if you will, but that there are all these other faith groups that are here. And they talked about doing a book to hand out to visitors. And my friend who had approved the Baha'i page and was a longtime friend of mine said, well, why should we do that? Peggy already wrote that book. Why don't we just put the Olympic rings on a new edition of her book? Let's write an introduction of our own, put it in the book. And also Jan Said, who's the Baha'i, recommended that we, in the back of the book, put the golden rule in every religious tradition in the book as well. And that was her idea, and that's still in there. So,
when you Google the book, you can find the original, the Olympic, and now this new and revised one. So for both of you, Kathy, and we can start with Kathy and then Peggy, why reissue this revised and expanded volume?
Well, it was time.
25 years, yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is one of my I think my most favorite project, I think, was this book. I loved it. I loved what I learned as I was studying, and Peggy's right, I did a lot of my own research for it. I became a convert to every religion. It was so moving to look inside and just think, well, yeah, I believe that too. And it just made me feel so much closer. And I think everybody should have that understanding of how much alike we are. We look different from the outside, but how much our beliefs are, how much we are alike in believing in a higher power and ethical behavior towards others. That's pretty common, isn't it? In all the religions, which, is the golden rule, actually. So I was so excited when Peggy called me and said, let's do this again. And she wanted to add a few more faiths to kind of expand it and make it more inclusive. And you can't possibly put all the faiths in or represent everything. Right. But she did a great job of kind of trying to choose something from every continent. And Peggy can probably explain that better.
Yeah.
Well, first, I should also say that one of the prompts for us redoing this book does come from Kathy's art, which is BYU's International Center for Law and Religion Studies had purchased the originals of Kathy's art and framed them, and they are hanging there in the law school. And they love the book so much that they had purchased all the remaining copies, making it go out of print, basically, and saying, please reprint this. And I said, well, we can't reprint it, but we can find a printer, a publisher to do it. And then I asked Kathy if she was willing to do 6 more illustrations. She was. And of course, this time we did have Google. It went by so much faster because we were able to do our research more quickly. But
I comment just to endorse that is it took me over a year to do all the illustrations and to look, and I spent a month or more on each faith.
Wow.
She did.
Just reading, like Peggy said, we read books. We went to the library. I used my parents' encyclopedia. I mean, kids today don't even know what that is. And this time, when she asked me, I sat down in 2 days. I had Googled. And not only that, I have a printer at home. I'd printed off information and photos right from my studio. I didn't have to go anywhere. It was just an amazing difference.
Mm-hmm. So what's different or new in this volume? What's been added?
Okay, we added, as I mentioned, we took out Amish and Christian Scientists. Mm-hmm. Sadly, there's not very many Amish in the world, and they're all in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And Christian Scientists, I'm sorry to say, are slowly dying. Mm-hmm. And also pretty American-based. So we wanted to make it more international, especially since the BYU's International Center was the one who was pushing this. And so we added 2 more Native American faiths.
Because you had like Hopis the first time,
We just had one.
Right.
And I mean, people are like, oh, just do, one Native American church or something. I was like, no. We're not doing that. And then we had one African, which was Yoruba, which is from Nigeria. And so we added 2 more Native Americans, 2 more Africans, 1 Asian, and 1 Latin American. And that was also hard to pick again, because now you're talking about sort of tribal traditions and faiths. And now you've got hundreds of those. In terms of Africa, well, the Native American and the African, I just decided we're going to try to do geographical diversity. And so for Hopis who are Western U.S., then I wanted, we picked Lakota, which is a sort of north mid country.
Plains, kind of up in that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then a variation on the Seneca, which is East Coast. And then for the Africans, we picked an East African Noor, which is basically in the Sudan, and then Zulu, which is in southern Sudan. So geographical diversity, that's the only way I could figure out how to do it. And then we added Janes, which I knew that's an Asian one, and I knew we should have had that in the first book, but there just wasn't room for it. And then one of my favorites, Kathleen, I love this faith group, is in Latin America, is mostly in Peru and Argentina. Pachamama, it's an earth.
Just having that name in there is worth it.
Exactly. Yeah. Earth
right.
Mother. I mean, we wanted some matriarchal women, more women. So that was really fun to add that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the editor in me, perhaps, but did you make any changes to your other ones that you had? And Kathy, did you change any of the paintings at all, or?
No, those are all. Those early paintings are all framed and hanging on the wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't change the original.
So you just did new ones.
She did new ones. Mm-hmm. And for myself, I changed almost every page as just, Dave, when you write for the newspaper and it's mostly online, you can change stuff all the time.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But when you write a book, you're really stuck.
Yep.
And I did get some feedback. I will tell you a quick anecdote. In the first edition, we had the Sikhs, right? And again, I did get it approved by a Sikh member here, but I had written, that the founder Guru Nanak was troubled by the conflicts between Hindus and Muslims. And so he wove those two faith groups together and created Sikhism. And again, people are not reading this online. They're reading this in libraries. And I got an angry letter from a Sikh member who said, why does everyone else in your book have spiritual experiences, whereas you act like our guy just sat down and wove these two together? He actually had a profound spiritual experience, not unlike Joseph Smith in the Grove or whatever. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And so I went back and read more, even though, again, it was approved. And that's one of the dangers, of course, is that you pick one person in the faith group to, affirm it.
Along with your other research, but yes.
Yes. And the danger is that person says it's fine, whatever, or not super sensitive. Anyway, so we changed that in the second edition. But now this sort of third-ish edition, I've had 30 plus years of writing experience now. There's words.
I'm probably writing about some of those faith groups, obviously, just in your daily job, which I know you've been doing.
I know more. I hope I'm a better writer than I was. So yeah, I changed almost little bits, just tweaking little bits.
Oh, yeah. Here's a question, obviously, and especially for our crowd. How did you handle the Mormon term this time around?
Oh gosh. And Kathy and I talked about this. Again, for our listeners, the LDS Church leader, Russell Nelson, has asked people not to use the term Mormon anymore, to refer to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and preferring Latter-day Saints as the shortened form. All the churches, all the faith groups have shortened forms, like Society of Friends is called Quakers. and stuff like that. So even in the first edition, of course, had the full name of the church, right? But went round and round in my mind about it, talked to people. But as Kathy has already said, the illustrations are all historical, and so much of it is history. And historically, Latter-day Saints were known as Mormons. And also, most Americans and most international folks have never heard of Latter-day Saints.
Mormon is still the most recognizable term.
Still the most recognizable. This book does not mention polygamy or anything like that, so it's not a negative term. But ultimately, we decided to go with Mormon.
But you do have a line in there.
I do have a line that says Mormons who now prefer to be known as Latter-day Saints.
Kathy, what was your thinking on this? Since you guys obviously talked about this.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Peggy said. I thought I know not everybody was excited about it, but I think we're way more recognizable that way.
Yeah. So no one's come back to you and say, hey, you had your chance to get that term out of there, or you
a couple
didn't
of people
take
have
it.
said that. Well, it remains to be seen whether it will be sold at Deseret Book or not.
Was the previous one?
It was.
It was.
Yeah.
So since this is Mormon land, and Kathy, I'll start with you. Do you think Latter-day Saints have a good grasp about other religions? And why is that important?
I'm going to say no, they don't. No, at least that was our experience when we first published the book, and we took it around to bookstores. Where did we take it? Like Fireside. We had groups, people coming, and it was surprising to me that if I held up the painting, there were very few people could identify which religion it was. I felt like Mormons were especially in that category. They weren't really interested in other religions, and so I think people of other faiths sometimes have more background on each other than Mormons typically. Would you agree with that, Peggy?
Yes, although I think it's becoming less the case.
Yeah,
I do think there's much more emphasis on interfaith activities, and the LDS Church is more involved and engaged with other faith groups. And so
it's changing.
I do think if we did all the same number of firesides, Kathy, that we did back then,
notice the difference.
We might notice some difference. But in general, I say I say this in the introduction, most faith groups are generally just interested in their own
pretty
group.
Insular anyway.
Yeah.
That is interesting though, then, because Mormonism is a proselytizing faith.
Right.
So you would think members are, constantly. Yeah. Interesting. So we talked a little bit about this, and it was mentioned. There's this rich religious diversity. You talked about how many are just right here in Utah.
Yeah.
In the heart of Mormondom, heart of the Mormon corridor. A matter of fact, there's a 2-block area, for instance, in Salt Lake City in 7th West near 4th North. There's a Bosniak mosque, a Vietnamese Buddhist temple, a Catholic church, and a Latter-day Saint meeting house, all within 2 blocks. That's right in the heart of Salt Lake City. And the goal of this book is sort of to showcase this religious diversity. How does religious diversity enrich a community? Peggy, I'll start with you.
Oh, I'm just so sold on religious diversity. Doing this book, like Kathy said, I was converted to all of them and just pretty much amazed at how much they have in common and how much they can learn from each other. And I just think it makes a community much more interesting to have diversity like that. Lots of these faith groups you just described in Salt Lake also have ethnic differences, which again is really wonderful. I mean, I remember, I don't know if there's still a group like this, but I went to an Ethiopian Orthodox church here that was meeting in a Protestant church, and then you walk in the door and you're transported to Ethiopia. Everyone's wearing white, and it was fascinating. Mm-hmm. When I started my job in 1991, there was 1 mosque. Now there's 13.
Yeah.
I also think religious diversity builds tolerance. Diversity makes for a more tolerant, more interesting place, and builds interfaith community, I guess.
Kathleen, what about you?
Yeah, exactly what Peggy's saying. But I think it's so easy to be a little fearful when there's a difference. Like if you don't speak the same language, it's kind of a barrier. And if you, when you learn to speak someone else's language, it's so much more easy to be friendly with somebody. And I think it's the same with religions. If you don't know what people believe and you don't know anything about them, it can be a little standoffish or fearful in some way. And so the more you understand it, the more it enriches my life to know about people, and it gives you so much more common ground and things that you can talk about where you might be fearful to ask about somebody's religion, but when you already know a bunch about it and you ask them with curiosity and with an honest question, people are delighted to tell you what they believe and it's just a way to make friends, and it's a way to unite instead of letting these things divide us.
Yeah. One of the, and you talk about this in the intros and the preface, but the different entries sort of talk about, you see features that in each faith where there are commonalities, which I think helps bridge some of those things. But it also seems to bring more richness to the differences too. Don't you think? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Yeah. Peggy, I mean, put that into words, what I'm trying to say.
I think that after doing all these faith groups, and people always ask me, what do they have in common? Because not all of them believe in, they're not monotheistic or one all-powerful God or something. But all of them do believe that there exists outside of this sphere something beyond. So something beyond, and what that something beyond expects of mortals is ethical compassionate behavior towards each other. And the third thing, and that's where the differences come in, is they all have some kinds of rituals to help people get there. And as much as anything, as you just suggested, I am fascinated by those differences. Like, would I be a better person if this was the way I learned about God versus this? What are these avenues, and do they make people more joyous or more disciplined? Or, I mean, there's just such differences, all with the same goals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Kathy, that comes out in your art too. Like you talked about how, each one you might include a representative building of some kind, something very iconic, and yet the differences emerge also, right?
Yeah, the different ways we approach things, and just to learn about those makes us stop and think, wow, that's another way. I did the same thing with Pat. I wonder if I would, how that would have changed me had I been brought up in a different way. And it's just good food for thought to question like that.
One final question for both of you. And we've kind of talked about your overall big aim for the book, but what do you hope readers take away from this book? Kathy?
I hope this is a way we can feel unity. And I think the more we understand about each other, the more compassionate we can be towards each other and ourselves, and just more. I just think that's my goal, is unity.
Peggy?
I guess I share that goal, of course. Let me just mention that when I was in high school, my high school yearbook editors chose quotes for us. We didn't choose them ourselves. And I was 17 years old, and the editors of my high school yearbook chose this quote for my picture, which said, "For we are all one people, and our diversity amazes me." I don't know who said it. I don't know where they got it, but somehow they knew, even back then, that I was interested in one people and diversity. And I feel like that's the message of the book. I also feel I guess I hope people read it and celebrate faith in a world where organized religion is seen as a waste of time and people can just get spiritual by themselves, which of course they can. But I love the communal aspects, and I hope people read the book and think about that part of it, which is these communities of faith bring so much to our lives that would be lost if all of a sudden everybody believed the same thing or nothing. And I guess it's a Valentine to groups and communities of faith celebrating together, reaching for the divine. I hope people get that out of the book.
The name of the book again is A World of Faith. Kathleen Peterson, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And of course, thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
A different kind of pleasure.
Yes. And to our producer, Christopher Samuels. We remind you to join Mormon Land on Patreon by Monday, May 15th to be entered to win one of 5 signed copies of the book. Current Patreons also will be entered. In addition to a giveaway entry, when you join us on Patreon, you'll get transcripts of our weekly podcast episodes, an extended Mormon Land newsletter, and access to the Trib's religion content, including subscriber-only stories. We'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.